Hi, everyone. I hope to dive deeper into the social aspects of carbon markets and focusing more on nature-based solutions and forest carbon governance. So please bear with me as I focus more on terrestrial forests coming from the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. But some of the lessons from social integrity can perhaps be applied to other credit types, such as cook stoves or even like Beck's biochar, for example. So let's dive into it. Well, I think most of you may be familiar why we focus on natural climate solutions. These are actions to protect, improve the management, and restore natural ecosystems. And it's for both terrestrial forests and also coastal, like mangroves. Why it's been touted as an interesting and important mitigation action is because it represents about a third of cost-effective. So the key here is low cost compared to other technologies. And also the more important distinguishing factor is the biodiversity and social co-benefits that the panel talked about as well. So they are among the top 5 most effective strategies to mitigate carbon emissions, according to the IPCC. So I'll dive into more on the social co-benefits element in this talk. Now, before that, there are lots of challenges in scaling NCS globally because, natural climate solutions are highly complex. No one solution is the same with the other. And so there's been a literature review of what are the enabling factors that influence implementation. This tree map just highlights the different categories of factors. And you can see that biophysical is actually a small component. But more than that, there are lots of economic, financial, institutional, social, and technical factors that underpin the implementation of NCS. So I think underlying all these factors is really carbon governance. And it's kind of understudied. So what is carbon governance? Basically, it's the interaction of various actors, including governments, corporates, NGOs, local communities, how they interact and shape the design and implementation and therefore the outcomes of carbon projects, and also how they are influenced by power power relations and dynamics. So it's important to understand governance that gives rise to all these different factors. I'm privileged to be affiliated to a research project based in the NUS called the Carbon Governance in Southeast Asia. It's a 5-year project hosted at the NUS Asia Research Institute that looks at the social and governance dimensions of NCS. And its objectives are to identify optimal arrangements across spatial and administrative scales, investigate successful examples, and assess transferability, as well as create a roadmap for Singapore and also strengthen linkages between natural and social sciences. And I think this is the important part, interdisciplinary understanding. There's been a lot of more focus on the carbon accounting part, but less so on the social sciences research. So there are 4 work packages looking at the different ecosystems, terrestrial, mangroves, coastal, peatland, as well as the systems, technologies, and social relations that govern these ecosystems. So my talk is divided into 2 parts. I'll first go through some of the key findings of a review paper that was published a few months ago, talking about the challenges in forest carbon governance in Southeast Asia. I think we all know the huge potential Southeast Asia has for NCS. It holds about 15% of the world's tropical forests. So this literature review looked at existing social science research on the governance of these forest schemes in Southeast Asia. And it's led by the CGSEA team, led by Dr. Ying Shan Lau, and I'm quite honored to be co-author and contributing to this paper. You can scan the QR code for the full paper or just ask me about it later on. So diving into the methods, we reviewed 170 research articles on Southeast Asia since 2013, which was when the Warsaw Framework on REDD+ was implemented. And this was screened from about more than 3,000 articles. So you can see that out of 3,000, actually only 10% or 300 was based on social sciences. And out of these 300, only 170 were focused on the governance aspects. So it's a knowledge gap that we should look at. The top countries in the literature were from Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But the caveat is that it's predominantly based on REDD+ and donor-supported projects. So projects like the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, so some of the payments for ecosystem services, so not entirely on the carbon markets, but there's a knowledge gap as well that we should address, and I'll make a case for it later. So I like this graphical abstract. It gives a summary of the findings, talking about the governance issues as, the roots, causes, and then leading to a research agenda. So I will first talk about the underground issues before going to what's next and recommendations for future research. So looking at 4 key areas: finance and the political economy, knowledge, implementation, inclusivity, equity, and justice. Firstly, for finance and the political economy, we all know that NCS projects, they don't operate in a vacuum. The wider political context is important to consider. And there's not been a lot of research on how the interactions and the power dynamics play out. So for the first point on development versus conservation, there's been, of course, REDD+ projects have delivered benefits, but deforestation drivers still prevail due to fundamental tensions between national economic development priorities and demographic changes. And these projects are 30-year-long projects, for example. So there's always this constant tension and what incentives are needed to keep these projects going and to prevent deforestation. Secondly, there's a lack of large-scale funding. So the financing landscape is mainly disjointed with varying objectives and conditions across different funding providers, both multilateral, bilateral, and now increasingly from the private sector. And finally, voluntary carbon projects are also playing a more important role. But the low carbon prices and volatility in the market can also hinder sustained and sufficient financial support for the long term. So these are some of the issues to look at in the next few years. On knowledge. So biases in knowledge production can also affect the implementation of NCS project because, generally in this audience, we are focused more on like the scientific, the technical, the accounting part of carbon projects. So this knowledge tends to limit accessibility to the broader society. And this is called the techno-managerial approach, and mainly towards the technocratic and political elite rather than affected communities. And I'll share an anecdotal example of this in a while. And next is on new technologies. So we've all known that there's increasing use of satellite remote sensing, AI, big data, but these also raise questions on how forests are being represented digitally and who bears responsibility for decision making. While these tools are important and they do facilitate scale and speed of implementation, it's important to consider how this leads to the democratization of knowledge and whether local communities can participate. So I like the example that from one of the panelists to say that you have to train the community members to also operate like LiDAR or satellite remote sensing so that they can get involved in the implementation as well. And finally, this also leads to the privileging of biophysical and geospatial knowledge. So there were instances from the literature that community-led monitoring had focused on more measuring carbon rather than how it enhances local ownership and decision-making. So similar to previous point. Next on implementation, while it has led to a lot of opportunities, it has also given rise to a lot of challenges. And design is the easy part, but implementing it for the long term is tough because you have to go through the whole project cycle of 30 years. So firstly, there are lots of coordination challenges, even in political and administratively, within and between scales. So different sectors, actors involved. Just for example, land classification by different ministries in Southeast Asia countries can be different. So in Laos, for example, they just merged the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change with the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry at the national level. But this has to translate at the provincial and district level as well. So how they coordinate will be important. Secondly, on elite capture. So there are interests of elites, or corporate elites, political elites that also affect the economy and impede the efficacy of participatory approaches, especially in REDD+ programs. So issues of corruption, for example. And Southeast Asia, this can be quite a significant challenge. Lastly, there are historical tenure issues such as unclear and complex tenure arrangements also affect the rights, responsibilities, and level of participation among local communities. So it's something to take note of. And it's not a problem that can be solved easily. And even within different countries, they have different national contexts to how they manage land tenure. The last theme, which is on inclusivity, equity, and justice. So this pertains to how you engage local communities. And generally, the implementation of free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, have been criticized for limited transparency or unfair due process and not full participation. There's also an unequal benefit sharing. So the opportunity costs and livelihood risk are typically not accounted for, and the benefits have arrived late to these communities in some instances. So for one of my chapters in my PhD, I dive into this benefit sharing topic, and I'll share a case study of it in the next few slides. And lastly, on the exacerbation of tenure issues. So not only are they complex, but they also displace locals from their livelihoods, and they may exacerbate some inequalities and also lead to unintended outcomes. So for example, I've read that one of the RED Plus project, they have led to locals gaining land for themselves, but they turned that land into developing it for cash crops like cassava instead of actually supporting the RED Plus project. So they've used it to their advantage to secure land tenure, but then to seek commercial returns from cash crops. This wraps up the different governance challenges. But moving forward, so what are some recommendations for future research or even implementation by project developers to take note of? Firstly, there's a shift from project-based to jurisdictional RED+. So it's important to assess prospects and the rollout of these alongside powerful sectoral interests, impacts on local communities, and also deforestation. The private actors, especially in Southeast Asia, are playing an increasingly important role and also in making investments. So there needs to be regulatory oversight, transparency, and accountability. Civil society organizations, NGOs also play important roles, such as the SEEN Coalition in developing safeguards and in guiding the ecosystem on this. Next. The third one is on the diversification of forest interventions. So all these recommendations are also based on the fact that there's very limited research on other pathway types like ARR. Most of research has been done on RED+. So there is a need to look at how other pathway types have their own specific governance issues and how we can draw lessons from subfields like community forestry. For example, for reforestation, it takes about 7 years for a tree to mature and for them to generate payments. So how are the revenue models then different from RED+, and how do you deal with them, and how do you share benefits with the communities? And lastly, on efforts to restore legitimacy, there are already existing benchmarks of high integrity that are being reviewed by ICVCM, VCMI. So I think efforts are in place to already look at high integrity. But who are the actors constituting these review committees, and how can transdisciplinary approaches be better promoted? So those are the recommendations in a nutshell. I'll now move on to a different concept, which is, or dive deep into more practical terms. So basing it on, grounding it in reality and how you develop projects. And I think it's useful to borrow a concept from business management called social license to operate. It's not commonly used in NCS literature, and I'll explain why. But generally, if you're in a corporate sector, you would understand this as the ongoing acceptance, approval, and support from communities and other stakeholders. It started off in the mining industry, and generally it's used in extractive industries like oil and gas and infrastructure since the 1990s. So it's because these sectors have high impact reputation, and they're mainly destructive. So they do need to have this intangible license to conduct their operations. Some of the key components are legitimacy, credibility, trust, and also strong SLO does support long-term project success. So how do we then apply SLO in an NCS literature? Now, it has not been explicitly used. Social safeguards and social integrity do dominate the terminology. And a quick search on ChatGPT, because it's hard to find like why SLO is not in NCS, shared that for NCS, projects are deemed beneficial, so it did not extract or damage the environment, supposedly, and also are mainly implemented by government and NGOs. But increasingly, with the rise of carbon markets, corporates are coming into the picture, and also there have been lots of cases of human rights violations and carbon removals being not permanent. So I think it's important now to look at it and just apply it as a holistic lens. Safeguards are usually looked at in silos, like FPIC, benefit sharing, tenure, but now we should look at integrity and social license to operate as an overarching framework, perhaps, and draw lessons from other sectors. So it is an emerging concept now being used in environmental governance, forestry, and restoration. There's a paper talking about the social license to restore, and this was from a peatland restoration project in Indonesia, where there were historical dispute issues with the government. And so the paper looked at how the project engaged the community and the government to establish mutual understanding, including like how they involve, interact, and intervene, and also develop indicators. So this is just a term they use, also borrowing from the social license to operate concept. Why does this matter to NCS? There is now increasing scrutiny, as we know, from in policy and implementation, lots of reports on these human rights violations from the media, bad press, but most of these are also related to the RED Plus projects, and other pathways are understudied. IPLC, as earlier on in the tree map, you've seen that it does constitute a key factor to implementation. So it's important to look at social integrity alongside environmental, like carbon and biodiversity. Interestingly, the definition of social integrity is quite varied compared to environmental integrity. Everyone agrees that 1 ton of carbon should be additional, permanent, real, leads to no leakage. But yet for social integrity, there are lots of varying definitions. But here is just a summary of some of the key concepts that have emerged. For example, FPIC, rights of local communities, land resources, inclusivity and empowerment in decision-making, and also throughout the project lifecycle, benefit sharing, grievance and redress mechanisms, transparency and trust. So cutting across would be governance. So how those governance issues, I talk about how they play out here, capacity building of the local communities, but also of project developers, of government agencies, and robust and adaptive monitoring throughout the project. Now, the idea on safeguards, social integrity is manifested in the form of, right now, safeguards in the carbon market. And naturally so, the projects have mainly focused on accountability. So MRV for carbon accounting has been quite strong. And on the social side, it's usually do no net harm or minimize harm to these communities. So how it started was the Cancun Agreement was in 2010, and that established the first RED Plus safeguards. Following that, there were other bodies like the FCPF, UN, developing their own environmental and social safeguards, and how this has evolved over the decades to carbon standards in the voluntary carbon market, where they have established their own standards on how do you address social issues, and they take on these no net harm approaches. But increasingly, now there are specific standards that go beyond carbon towards net positive impact, such as climate, community, and biodiversity standards, which one of the panelists mentioned. And interestingly, I also found out recently there's a women empowerment standard that provide credits for verified women empowerment impact. But of course, these are stacking on to existing carbon standards. And Art-Trees is launching their Beyond Carbon Benefit certification as well. So they usually focus on biodiversity and community. Now, it's easier said than done. There are still lots of challenges in implementing social integrity in projects. This year, a paper was published on case study analysis of 8 countries in the global south and how they revealed violations of social safeguards. As you can see, for example, for free, prior, and informed consent, most countries have reported violations. And there is also a widespread lack of empirical evidence on the implementation of safeguards to protect local rights. So I think it just means that more research is needed and also robust monitoring of these issues. Now, I'm happy to share a case study on benefit sharing because I just came back from Laos to do fieldwork. And I looked at 2 afforestation projects in the voluntary carbon market. So they are verified and have issued carbon credits. What we did was to interview the households, so the local villagers. So we had household questionnaires, interviews, and also focus group discussions with women specifically and also with men And the insights they shared were really interesting to me. So, for example, the definition of benefits vary based on the stakeholders' perspective. From a carbon standard perspective, carbon benefits should strictly be revenues from the carbon credits that are passed on. But from the villagers' perspective, benefits are just the job security that they get and the income from selling the commodities. So, I mean, they don't really understand carbon credit revenue, or it's too abstract for them. Second is on the limited understanding of carbon markets. So this goes back to the point on knowledge. Most of them have not heard of the term carbon or even the carbon credit, and the project developer, for some, did share with them when they were applying for the certification. So they checked maybe about 2-3 years back, whereas these projects have started like maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but they've only applied for carbon credit certification recently. And how they explained to them was that, or how they understood it was that the companies are selling good air from the trees to other countries. And those local communities are curious, how do you sell good air? And so they asked, do you bottle it up and sell it? So it's quite interesting that they do have a limited understanding, but I think there's interest to understand them more and how it impacts them. And they've also asked questions like, do we get money from this payment and this sale of air? So, but to date, they have not had satisfactory responses from the companies. And finally, adaptive management is critical to successfully engage these local communities for the long term. For example, at the point in time when they signed a contract with the company, they were told that the price of a certain commodity was fixed. But however, over 10-15 years, that price has increased. And so many of them are unhappy that they are getting low prices. So they're missing out on the opportunity costs. And they've tried to negotiate with the company, but without any success. So I think this is an area to consider, that we have to constantly engage them and understand their feedback, because verification exercises usually happen every 2-3 years. Yet these communities work daily and engage with the plantation. And interestingly, they mentioned that when they had no response from the company for quite a while, they didn't know what to do with the plantations. So what did they do? Well, they just burned the trees and they use it to grow other crops. So then that has effects on permanence and even like leakage issues. So it's important to really, understand how happy they are and address issues quickly before they become serious problems. So finally, my last 2 slides on the key takeaways. Firstly, on governance. Research into effective governance strategies is needed, especially as new approaches emerge, such as jurisdictional scale, and frameworks also evolve with the inclusion of compliance markets. Social integrity should be assessed holistically, drawing lessons perhaps from social license to operate concept used in other sectors. The definition of high integrity carbon credits should also move beyond social safeguards and do no net harm approaches to delivering positive impact and empowering our IPLCs throughout the project lifecycle. So high integrity does not only mean high quality, but also it should have high ambition to deliver impact where possible. But of course, it's easier said than done. There's also a lot of cost and time and effort to measure impact. So I think that's an ongoing discussion and how the industry can do better as an ecosystem. And finally, while there are robust metrics for carbon, the market has not yet converged on standard indicators and best practices for social outcomes monitoring. So while we have put in a lot of resources, financial, political, technical, for carbon, I think we should do so similarly for social outcomes, given the importance of social impact and also the long-term horizons of these projects. And lastly, I just wanted to end with the generational impact that these projects cause, because as they are 30-year long, when we speak to them, they mention that perhaps their father or the head of household signed the contracts, but now they are inheriting those legacies and those challenges and problems. So it's affecting their livelihoods as well. But at the same time, when we ask them, will you participate in similar projects in future? Their immediate answer is yes, despite the challenges, because it really improves their livelihood and, more importantly, gives them job security. Even when payments are late or prices are low, they really value the opportunity to work close to their village and provide a stable income for their family. So it's really complex, and thank you so much for listening.